Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this morning with you all. And as the session opened yesterday, I found that everything that I wanted to say was already said by the two brilliant speakers yesterday. So therefore I had to backpedal somewhat and say all of the above to what they said yesterday, because basically speaking, hospitality in the Christian tradition is following on the Jewish tradition, so that most of what they were telling us about hospitality as a general rule in Judaism applies to the Christian tradition. And I only have to remind you that Jesus Christ, in his own words, came not to abolish, but to fulfill, and that not a jot or a tittle, which I always thought was a wonderful phrase, of what was in the Jewish law was to be removed. It was to actually be fulfilled and perfected. So my question, therefore, my talk is called, If You're Irish, Come Into the Parlour, There's a Welcome There for You. And that implies that if you're not Irish, so that my question is that in every single religion that regards itself as a great religion, everybody is asked to be hospitable to the other, to the stranger. I only have to quote to you various passages from St. Luke, for instance. Love your enemies, be good to everyone who hates you, ask God to bless anyone who curses you, and pray for everyone who is cruel to you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, don't stop that person from slapping you on the other cheek. If someone wants to take your coat, don't try to keep back your shirt. Give to everyone who asks, and don't ask people to return what they have taken from you. Treat others just as you want to be treated. Now that's all on the brochure. And every single religion has it on the brochure. But we all know that it is slightly different what's on the brochure and what happens at the hostel when you get there. So the first point I'm making is that hospitality is in every religion a required tenet. And sometimes that hospitality is out of enlightened self-interest. Quote, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. That's Hebrews 13:2. So therefore, your reason for being hospitable is, this creep who's coming in the door could be an angel, so watch out. That's the sort of enlightened self-interest which is involved in this. Sometimes hospitality is your ticket to everlasting life, as in the Christian story of when the sheep are being divided from the goats in the final roundup of Christianity. Depart from me, ye accursed. Why, you ask? And they say, because I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me. And those who did welcome the stranger, even if they didn't realize they were doing so, they are forever blessed. I was a stranger and ye took me in. When did I take you in, Lord? Whenever you did this to anybody else, you did it to me. So that's kind of like an insurance policy, that you do that and you get everlasting bliss as a result. So even at its most unselfish, hospitality is still somewhat tribal. We are all citizens of the world, Epictetus said some years before Christianity was founded. Nowhere will one find a stranger. Christianity is based on the difficult premise that we should love our enemies, even those who hate us. So, that's saying that everything that was said about the Jewish tradition yesterday so brilliantly applies to Christianity, which is a continuation of Judaism in the view of the Christians. And we use all the Jewish texts as part of our sacred canon. But that's the theory. It's very simple and it's probably universal. But it remains at the level of wishful thinking. And everything that was said yesterday about how little time the Jews have had to practice being in charge of countries and of large political institutes does not apply to the Christians. If I calculate, from 315, we have had 1,694 years of experience of putting into practice all those things that we have been, in theory, loving our enemies, welcoming all those who are different from us, and that's where the little problem comes in. I'm speaking personally. I come from a country which is Christian. And in that country, at least one politician is getting elected on the grounds, and I quote, 86% of the Irish people do not want to meet a foreigner. Now, that's not just a maverick statement. That means that the people who are voting for him are saying, I wouldn't say it myself, but I'm voting for you for saying it. You see, that's the problem. And in certain parts of that Christian country, children of 7 years of age will not stand beside another child of 7 years of age because one is a Catholic and the other is a Protestant. Two versions of Christianity. They say that at an international conference, not quite as prestigious as this one, on the elephant, several experts from around the world were collected to give their papers. And the German paper was on Loxodonta complexa, Beiträge zur sozialpsychologischen Untersuchung des elefantischen Tanzverhaltens. The French paper was on La sexualité de l'éléphant. The English paper was on elephant hunting in the 19th century in India, in the second half of the 19th century. And the Irish paper was on the elephant and my fight for Irish freedom. In the year 2002, the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party and First Minister in Northern Ireland, some of you may be familiar that this conflict that's going on between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, he was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Protestant Party, and to advance the so-called peace process, He gave a talk to improve cross-border relationships with Southern Ireland, in which he said that, I quote, "The Republic of Ireland is mono-ethnic, monocultural, pathetic, and sectarian." This was to improve connections between the two parts of the country. The Taoiseach of the southern part of our country, Mr. Bertie Ahern, replied that no one would identify that description with our state in the Republic of Ireland, and he went on to smirk. "We don't have any Drumcree or Garvaghey road down south," which was another way of saying one in the orange windpipe for Mr. Trimble. That was his form of insult. Now, the question I'm asking here today is, these two politicians imagined they were trading insults, but what if what they were saying was an axiom? That every single child that's born on this planet is born mono-ethnic, monocultural, pathetic, and sectarian. By birth, by nature, by biology. That's the way we are, or maybe we wouldn't have survived. Now, if that is true, then the only thing that makes us capable of doing what both the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition prescribe is education, art, and a certain kind of religion. Because if it is true that we are born selfish, short-sighted, and antisocial by definition because we're afraid, because we know that there are enemies out there looking to destroy us, that it's the survival of the fittest, and that requires us to be tribal if we're going to survive, and that what Herbert Butterfield says, whatever our hopes about progress in terms of history and civilization, every child is born equidistant from barbarity. So this is the question. Is it actually true that we are hospitable by nature? Or is it true we have to learn to be hospitable, and that learning requires education, artistic imagination to imagine what it's like to be the other, another, and then a tradition, a religious tradition, which teaches us that there's more to this life than our survival. It was a relief to me when I was in Nigeria for 3 years and went to a part of Nigeria where no other white person, we call ourselves white, that's another myth, but with the kind of skin that I have, blotched red or green or whatever you want to call it, that when I was in Nigeria, little tiny children were horrified. They thought I was a monster. And they would run screaming to their mothers. And it required that the mother would take them up in her arms and touch my face with the child's hand, and a certain number of days of initiation of that kind before they said, "This animal doesn't bite." That this is actually a friendly creature. Now that was a great consolation to me, because it means that that's the way children are, because they're afraid, because they don't know any different. And that we all have to learn that this is a great work that has to be done to make us hospitable. That we don't, it's not high moral ground that people are inhospitable. We look down on them and we say they are monsters. It is the way we are by our nature, and we have to learn to be different, and that the great religious traditions teach us that. They teach us to open ourselves to the other. Now, Emmanuel Levinas believed that the great religious traditions were essentially forms of atheism, that they cut us off from a natural religion. That if we're born as biologically tribal, a natural religion comes with that package. And a natural religion is a tribal religion, and the tribal religion is one which has as its first commandment the sacrifice of the alien on the altar of the incumbent. That is what it is. And you sacrifice the alien because you want to preserve your patch. And what he said, Levinas, was that Judaism cut that root between nature and religion. That it's no longer a natural religion, which is a fearful religion. Religion, like art, can paint the walls of the prison we are in and decorate the bars. It can be a natural, biological phenomenon instead of being a call to go beyond the black tents of the tribe. And in fact, it nearly always is such a deadening, restrictive straitjacket, unless in each generation and in the life of every person we are led out of slavery and bondage. Denominational religion is nearly always such a cultural artifact. And that's the real tragedy. And we, and especially the leaders in religion, need imagination and genuine religious leadership to lead us out of the prison which every religion becomes once it's allowed to revert to that natural biological state. I'm glad to hear that one of your books is about the impossibility of dialogue. I have a book on dialogue in the Roman Catholic Church, and it's called I Must Be Talking to Myself. Love your enemy, welcome the stranger, treat everyone as your equal, treat them as you would treat yourself. All of that runs contrary to the natural order. An order where most tribes think of themselves as the chosen people, the place where the world began, and every other tribe as lesser and less favored by the gods. So the point that I really want to make here this morning is that hospitality is an act. It is something we do. It is not something that we inherit. It is not a state of being that because you happen to be a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist that you are then therefore hospitable. Jesus Christ, on the most important, the crucial moment of his life on this earth, said, "Do this in memory of me." Do this. It was an activity. And that activity is an act of hospitality. It's an act of welcome to the other, meaning God as well as meaning other Christians. So this means that we're talking about doing in a way that, for instance, Heidegger talks about doing as poetry, from the Greek word to do or to make. Everything that happens in our world otherwise is part of automatic functioning, natural functioning. Unless each one of us performs the miracle which is changing our human nature into the body and blood of Christ, turning water into wine, turning natural reaction towards anything into supernatural reaction to everything. And every form of that doing is an artistic work. Every form of that doing is a miracle in the sense that it goes beyond the nature that we received as our being on this planet. And another part of that means that we do miracles. Anything we do in that way is always a miracle, and nothing can be done in this way unless it is a miracle. So therefore, hospitality is a miracle, and it's a miracle that we perform, each one of us, because we are called to go beyond ourselves. Hospitality is the miracle that we do. So, what I'm saying about that is there is no such reality as Christianity in itself. There are only Christians who are moved by the Spirit to be like Christ. And Christ, as we understand it, was the perfection of the promise which was made by God to humanity. And that also means, and a very strange thing, that most Christians are unbearable unless they are crucified. That's what it means. And have been unbearable for 1,694 years, during which they have been in charge of most of this planet. Because tribal religion kicks in, because power and all the natural tendencies, and we've had so much analysis of those natural tendencies. The 20th century produced, for instance, Marx, who told us that the natural tendency that ran the world was greed, money, and Freud told us that the natural tendency that ran the world was sex, and Nietzsche told us that the natural tendency that ran the world was power. So that is why Christians who want to actually make some contribution towards the transfiguration of those natural motives, take vows of chastity against sex, of obedience against power, and of poverty against money or greed. And then, as Nietzsche says so wonderfully, the bitch sensuality, when she cannot have her pound of flesh, begs for a pound of spirit instead. So that you transform that once again into another form of power and spiritually controlling your subjects. So we have to be at every moment aware of the fact that unless we do hospitality, each moment of our lives, another force kicks in, and we're kicking everybody else out the door. There are only Christians who are moved by the Spirit. And when I say that they should be crucified, I'm talking about something quite different from the literal interpretation of crucifixion, which, for instance, every Passover in the Christian tradition, in certain places, they actually nail people onto a cross. And this is meant to be a wonderful imitation of Christ, when in fact it's an absolute aberration of everything that Christ came on earth to do. I am talking about crucifixion not as a literal fact, but as a pentagram of the 5 wounds, the stigma that St. Francis carried on his body, because our members, our hands, are predatory hands. And you only have to put your biro into the hand of a tiny child and you'll have difficulty getting it back again, because the natural reaction is to close around everything that's in that hand. Our hands are naturally there to grasp and to take. And our feet are naturally hunters' feet. Each of our particular limbs was designed to fight, to protect, to grasp, to hold, and to hang on for as long as was possible. So the wounds of Christ are an effective opposition or transfiguration of our limbs, the dark currents of our human motivation, the desire to be great, the desire to take, the desire to keep, the desire to advance with your feet at the expense of everybody else, the desire to hold on to everything at the expense of everybody else. The 5 wounds of Christ were a breakthrough into the world of greedy senses and covetous limbs. Vulnus, the Latin word for a wound, describes the hallmark of Christianity as vulnerability. A wound is also a door. The eye is a wound covered by a lid. It's what lets the world into the prison in which each one of us is incarcerated. But the senses, our 5 senses, are organs of perception and not of action. They are passive receptors. The 5 organs of action are our 2 legs, our two arms and our heads. And these have to develop analogous wounds, otherwise we will always be inhospitable. So Christianity calls that the crown of thorns for your head and the spear that pierces to the center of the heart. The fifth wound is the wound of organic humility, which replaces the natural current of the will to power. This wound penetrates to the heart. So it doesn't matter what our religions have as a brochure or a pamphlet or a catechism or a set of regulations or rules. The only thing that matters is that each one of us, wherever we come from, whatever tribe we belong to, develops the miracle of hospitality in our own lives, that each one of us becomes, in Latin, a pontifex, a word which has been so misused and abused in certainly my own denomination. But it comes from the Latin pons and facere, to make a bridge. The bridge between us and the genuinely and absolutely other, which is created through open wounds, like the tent we were heard yesterday that was opened at the four sides. We also have to open ourselves, and Christianity holds a victory sign for the divine breakthrough. The freedom which we have been given as a possibility is so powerful and so dangerous that it also can lead us to making a hell of our own construction, because that's what freedom means. It is the free choice of surrender, the free choice of hospitality or hostility. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, first of all, Father Hillman. I think this was just a very powerful evocation of some of the sources that we have in Christianity to express our vulnerability and our humility, which are essential parts of hospitality. I will come back to some of the points you made and weave them into what I want to talk about, which is more focusing on the particularity of interreligious hospitality. So we've heard yesterday about also the hospitality, Jewish hospitality towards the stranger, and today we will hear about hospitality in different religious traditions. What are the sources for genuine hospitality? But what I want to explore today is what is the particularity or the specificity of interreligious hospitality and what are its limits. So what I would like to propose is a few ideas. Some of you may be familiar with them, because I know Professor Carney assigned or at least distributed a chapter of my book on hospitality, and what I would like to do today is maybe summarize a few elements from that chapter for consideration and maybe discussion. So what is the specificity of interreligious hospitality? All of the religions, as we heard, emphasize the importance of hospitality towards the stranger, towards the other. But what does that include? How far can that go? When we are hospitable towards the religious other, what does that mean when somebody from another religion comes into my house? Does that person have to adapt to my way of being religious, to my laws and rules? To which extent can I allow the other to be genuinely other in my house? To put it maybe more concretely, to which extent can I, can we as Christians, for example, allow Muslims to pray in their own way in our churches? To which extent do I try to welcome the other by adapting myself to their rules, or does the host or does the guest have to adapt to the rules of the host in terms of interreligious hospitality? So what is the give and take, or to which extent can I really embrace and be hospitable to the religious other in their alterity, in their difference? And that is what I would like to explore. I certainly don't have an answer to that. It's becoming a more and more contemporary question also in Europe, where many Christian churches are now becoming mosques where people are praying in a completely different way. And to which extent is that really also a call to hospitality on the Christian from the Christian side? So those are some of the questions which I would like to explore. I think what we have heard so far about hospitality is indeed very true, that religions maybe civilize people into an attitude of openness and hospitality which is not naturally given. On the other hand, I think we can't also ignore the fact that religions create their own boundaries and their own blockages to genuine hospitality. So that is what I think we have to face in terms of interreligious hospitality, that the religious self-understanding, the religious way of being and rituals are themselves an inhibition to genuine and full hospitality, and to which extent are religions capable of rethinking that or considering that and stretching those boundaries of hospitality. So I want to look at the specificity of interreligious hospitality, and maybe also stretch those limits that can constitute interreligious hospitality. And I will just look at it from the Christian perspective, as I was asked this morning. I think looking at it from a Christian perspective, there are largely three types of hospitality we can consider. The first type of hospitality is a kind of hospitality irrespective of the particularity of the religious other. So that is, I think, what we are indeed called to as Christians, to be hospitable and welcoming irrespective of who the other is or who the guest is in our house. But there is something also problematic of that aspect of irrespective of the other, because sometimes that also includes a kind of indifference to the other as other. So when we talk of hospitality, we usually think of the other coming into my house and conversing with the other, listening to the other, maybe learning from the other. And that's where I think hospitality should be understood to its fullest. How can I listen and learn from the other, from the guest who comes into my house? And that is, I think, where we should be stretching or pushing the idea of interreligious hospitality. And usually, I think, for most religious traditions, the idea of hospitality has to do mostly with the idea of being welcoming and generous to the other, irrespective of their own tradition. There's a sense with interreligious hospitality that when the other comes into my house, into my church, into my religious space, they are called to adapt to my environment. And that, I think, is the natural religious way of being. But obviously, we're not going to exchange very much. We're not going to learn very much from or about each other if that is our understanding of hospitality. So that is the first type, I think, of hospitality, which is the natural type of religious hospitality that you find in many different religious traditions. A second type of interreligious hospitality, I think, involves welcoming the other insofar as they are the same or similar to myself. So interreligious hospitality in that sense would involve recognizing certain practices and certain beliefs that are particular to the other insofar as they are the same, insofar as I recognize them. So again, a relatively easy form of interreligious hospitality. We welcome the other insofar as they are the same as we are. And it's a kind of tribal hospitality maybe that Father Hildeman also talked about. It's natural maybe or most convenient to welcome the other and to recognize the other in their similarities to who we are. So in interreligious hospitality, what we often look for are those similarities. So when we talk to people from other religious traditions we focus on those similarities, we make those similarities a point of connection, a point of praying together, a point of working together. So the similarities are usually the bridge and an important bridge between religious traditions. But I think interreligious hospitality could and should go further in terms of welcoming the other really in their otherness, in their real alterity. But there is where, of course, the question of the limits of that difference is raised, and I'm sure we will go into this at some length, or we can go into this at some length in the discussion. But this, I think, is a much more challenging form of interreligious hospitality, and how can we push our respective traditions to allow for the difference, and maybe to allow for the possibility of learning from that difference, of integrating some of that difference into our own traditions, into our own homes, into our own ways of being. So that's, I think, where the possibility of genuine dialogue and growth and learning takes place. So since it's not a natural way of being or a natural form of hospitality, I think every religion will have to work at this type of hospitality. I think no religion by nature is very receptive to what challenges its own self-understanding, because that's, of course, part of the problem. That difference is always a matter of challenge, that there's not just difference in complementarity, but there is also a difference in contradiction. And how does that, how can that be brought into a fruitful and constructive encounter between the host of a particular religion and the guest of another religion? Within Christianity, this is something that theologians have actually explored at some length, and every religion, as I said, has to find the resources within itself to open itself, I think, up to that kind of hospitality that allows for the alterity of the other and even learns from that alterity. Within Christianity, the resource that we find and that most religious most theologians have explored is that of the Trinity. So the Christian notion of the Spirit, in particular, I think, is one that is fruitful and has allowed Christians to explore the excess of God's presence in other religious traditions, and the possibility that God's Spirit may be a source or may be present in what is different in other religions. So in the Christian notion of the Trinity, and particularly the idea that the Spirit goes beyond what we already know, the Spirit goes where it wills, there is a notion that God can be genuinely present and active in other religious traditions in their difference. How much difference can any religion tolerate, and in particular, how much difference can Christianity tolerate? That's, of course, the challenging question. Most Christians will always look at the other from within the context of what they already know. So there will be a recognition of difference and a certain continuity with what is already part of their own tradition and part of their own belief structure. And I'm not sure any religious tradition can go very far beyond that. There is always sort of a sense of an identity or a religious culture that every religion will be concerned to preserve. So the radical difference that is incompatible with one's own religious tradition, I think, will always be a challenge to accept. We can recognize it and love the other in that kind of difference, I think, but the question is whether we can really learn from that radical difference. I think that is where the problem of alterity presents itself. On the other hand, every religious tradition is so rich and diverse that there is always a vast area of continuity, I think, with our own tradition that is open to enrichment and to learning. And it requires really, I think, that openness and that attention to difference and the possibility of God's revelation in the other religious traditions, for that hospitality in the fullest sense of the term to manifest itself. So these are a few points that I wanted to make about the specificity of interreligious hospitality, and I look forward to discussion on this. Thank you.
So thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Patrick, for those very challenging and engaging, I might even say arresting presentations. I think the conversational tone and style of your deliveries is itself conducive to extending the dialogue to the floor, which we will now do. We have 30 minutes or so for discussion, so over to you. Yes, Urida.
Thank you very much for these two presentations, which were very interesting and certainly, I think, give us a lot of food for thought here. And I'm fixated on food right now. I'm fixated on the notion of food because what we've been hearing about hospitality as an act of bringing someone, into the tent, but immediately, as we heard yesterday, the immediate gesture is you have to bring the stranger in and feed. And feed the stranger. That the food is a fundamental step, in which you actually perform the act of hospitality. And as I was listening to you, Catherine, I thought this was very interesting, the way in which you insist on the limits of the exchanges that can take place, the limits of this hospitality. And I'm thinking in terms of that this might actually allow us to see another aspect of the complexity of the act of hospitality that is given but needs to be received. And there are times when hospitality cannot be received. In particular, if you invite somebody to your table, there are times, and we know specifically within the different religious groups, there are some religious groups who cannot accept an offer of hospitality from another one. And in particular, as we know, these religious traditions, each religious tradition had a very important and powerful narrative about what could be served at the table. And so it's interesting, as I was listening to you, thinking about, in Europe now we're talking about allowing Muslims, to use churches to pray. So that's one form of hospitality. Then the other form of hospitality that's also problematic is, are there acts of hospitality that I cannot receive without actually giving up my otherness, my specificity, and to what extent is that act of hospitality sometimes a violence to my otherness and my integrity? And so that's a question I wanted to ask you. And maybe I can make it more specific because I'm also thinking about very specific notions that, as we know in Europe in particular, there was a long history of conflict between, in terms of allowing minority groups, especially Jewish groups first, to have their own rituals, for slaughtering meat, and this was heavily regulated, since the Middle Ages, and of course, we know the history, during the Nazi occupation of parts of Europe. This question is now becoming an issue for Muslims in Europe. The question of do Western societies have to make space for religious rituals that are in conflict or in contradiction with their own practices? So that's the other thing I have in mind.
Right. I'm not sure that it's what you're talking about is a refusal of hospitality on the part of the other. It's the question of the limit of really being hospitable towards the other. If you're talking about Jews or Muslims in Europe, for example, which might be a predominantly Christian culture, and recognizing the possibility of the other. If you're talking about refusal of hospitality, it would be probably an example of that might be if the Eucharist were, for example, offered to a Muslim or a Jew and they would not receive it, right? That would be a refusal of the hospitality from a Christian, or vice versa if a Christian would participate in a Jewish Seder and refuse to participate in it. Yeah, and I think that points exactly to, I think, the limits of hospitality between religious traditions. The question is how far can religions still stretch their boundaries and their imaginations in order to allow for that without giving up their own self-identity. And I think that is precisely what has to be confronted. I think every religion would have to look at that for itself and see how those limits work in every concrete situation. I don't think there is an answer for every situation.
But what I meant to convey is that sometimes an offer of hospitality is actually problematic for the person who is about who has to decide whether to receive it or not.
Right.
You know, so
absolutely.
yeah.
Patrick, do you want to add anything to that? We move on to the next question.
Move on to the next question.
Okay.
This question is directed perhaps more toward Catherine. Thank you both for your stimulating comments. I wanted to ask a question that sort of touches on three themes in Catherine's presentation. One was the first kind of hospitality in which the specificity of the religious tradition is, let's say, predominating. The second has to do with limits, and the third has to do with the Christian understanding of spirit as a source of hospitality. And it's a question about the relationship between the three. And I just want to begin with an anecdote that I spent a year in residence at a Lutheran university. Now, admittedly, the differences between Lutheran practices and beliefs and Roman Catholic are not nearly as great as they are among other religious traditions. But nevertheless, it was very. I very much felt myself to be very different in a Lutheran context, and yet there was a tremendous amount of hospitality. Some of my best friends to this day remain the people that I was in fellowship with in that Lutheran context, and yet there were those places of friction and tension. And I think that the differences were themselves extremely fruitful sources of growth, both in my own self-understanding of myself as an individual, biographical, existential person, but also as a Roman Catholic. And I know from my conversations over the years since that time, also with my Lutheran friends. So I guess I wanted to probe a little bit more the way that you moved from your first version of hospitality onto the second too, and go back and ask about the importance of that and the possibilities of that. And I think perhaps your first and your third are really not so different, or maybe there are two different ways of looking at the same thing, in the sense that it was clear to me that what made it possible for me to be for that experience to be so profitable was the profound sense in which my Lutheran brothers and sisters were indeed living out of the Spirit, as I understand it, and to some extent perhaps that despite my worst tendencies, the Spirit was also making it possible for me to make something out of what were often difficult conversations that I had there. And if I could just add to that, this question about limits, I just wonder if I could ask, perhaps as part of the same question, if not as a second question, I do think we tend to think about limits of religious traditions as though they were somehow really fixed, when in fact my experience has been of certainly my religious tradition, I think of most, that they're always in tension and they're always being transcended and they're always being transgressed, that any genuine religion is one which has limits and thinks it knows where its limits are, and then lo and behold, 10 or 50 or 1,000 years later, discovers it has been pulled beyond those limits in ways that make the kind of hospitality that you're talking about more possible. So I just wonder if you had any reflections on those comments.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Both, I think, are very, very interesting and promising avenues for reflection. In terms of my three types of hospitality, I think they are quite different. I mean, just to put them in simple terms, the first type would be you and your Lutheran friends not talking at all about your religion and just expressing kind of friendship and warmth and that kind of hospitality, irrespective of your religious traditions. The second type is if you really do talk about your differences or your respective religions, but only focus on the similarities. The third type is when you start opening yourself up to what is different and see sort of sources of enrichment in those differences also. But that's where it becomes dangerous also, because differences are challenging and can question my own sort of self-confidence about what I believe and so on. So those are sort of the three types, I suppose, of hospitality, and I think they are indeed quite different. And I invoke the Spirit as the source of the third type of hospitality, because that's where I can expand my own self-confidence and see maybe some elements of truth in difference and in elements that are not already part of my own self-understanding. But going from there to the second question about my own self-understanding, you're of course absolutely right that there is no fixed and final and permanent boundary to any particular religious traditions, that religious traditions are porous and evolving and constantly changing, which doesn't mean, on the other hand, that there are no boundaries, of course. And it's in the negotiation, I suppose, of those boundaries, and you often only realize your own boundaries when you are confronted with otherness, and you try to stretch your own boundaries to go as far as you can in sharing in their worldview and sharing in their rituals, and then you sometimes just realize what your own boundaries are, as you point out with the example, I think. So yeah, I mean, and that's what I think is creates the possibility of genuine dialogue and growth, because those boundaries are changing, and we learn, about the very source of who we are and how that can change in time through dialogue with others. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the boundaries manifest themselves most clearly in ritual life, and I think that's of course where religions are most static and where the differences are most simple and obvious, I think, and where religions change the least quickly. So in terms of thought and worldview and so on, there's much more development, I think.
Patrick, could I ask you actually, I know you're passing on and we have more questions, but perhaps just a comment on what Catherine said about Glenstal as an ecumenical centre, where the question of ritual and sharing in rituals must have come up as Catholics, and as you, it's a Catholic denomination, and a Catholic monastery, Benedictine monastery, welcome in the different Protestant denominations in Ireland, with the history of conflict that is involved there. How practically, since you talk about doing hospitality, did it or did it not work at the level of ritual and limit?
Well, I think we're talking about, first of all, the fact that in every great religion where God is a mystery, and there are, as Catherine says, great mystics in every tradition who have defended rigorously the impossibility of any denomination or any religion possessing as a limitation God. So every one of us is climbing the same mountain from a different angle or position. So our position in Glenstal Abbey as a monastery is that we are a Benedictine monastery, which was founded, therefore, in the year 480. That's when Saint Benedict. So it goes, all its ritual and all its liturgy precedes any of the great divisions in Christianity. And therefore anybody who wishes to take part in the liturgy is welcome to do so. It's up to them whether they find it to be offensive or impossible. That we don't have basically the problem in Ireland of other religions, because we're so involved with our own family quarrel between Protestants. And in fact, there's a story in Northern Ireland that a man was coming out of a cinema and was attacked by the various thugs that are representing themselves as either Catholic or Protestant. And they said, "Are you a Catholic or are you a Jew?" He said, "Are you a Catholic or a Protestant?" He said, "No, actually I'm a Jew." They said, "That's not the question. Are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew?" You see, so that makes it slightly different.
Okay. Peter Hadley. Actually, it picks up from the last point, thinking of thuggery outside a movie theatre. In a certain way, what I'm interested in is the fault line between religion and culture, because I would wonder whether, if, as Father Hederman says, that it is a tenet of every religion, which it clearly is, hospitality is a tenet of every religion, is it not equally the case that it's a tenet actually of every social group? Okay, because if the tribe, if we call them tribes, is determined by what is outside it, okay, then it's necessarily determined by its relationship with what is outside it. So therefore, you're talking about rituals not merely of exclusion and belonging, but also rituals of interaction, of relationship, okay? So, I mean, obviously there's a symbiosis between religion and culture, always. But I mean, you could argue, it seems to me, that actually cultural affiliation in many respects precedes religious affiliation, if you look historically at ways in which social groups have changed their religious affiliations and brought their own social practices into religious context, okay? So I guess my concern here is to suggest that I'm just troubled by the suggestion that the gesture of welcome, the gesture of hospitality, is a prerogative of religion. That would, yeah, that's my question, I guess.
Yes, I think I just quote from Clifford Geertz, for instance, here, that he calls everybody who's on the planet a cultural artifact. Okay, so we become who we are under the guidance of cultural patterns, historically created systems of meaning, in terms of which we give form, order, point, and direction to our lives. So if we accept that as that's his interpretation of cultures. So in that sense, then religion forms part of that package in a way, okay? But the point that Emmanuel Levinas makes, and that Jewish and Christian theologians would make, is that the essence of great religion, if you want to call it like that, is that it comes from another source. It's not just a cultural artifact. That the essence of it is that it is a revelation. So once it's a revelation, it's something that bursts into and through what we as cultural artifacts construct around ourselves as the house in which we live. So that, if you don't believe that, as 2.5% of the world's population don't, so we're told anyway, at least they sign down as being atheists, well then it's very difficult to say which comes first, the religion or the culture. Now, I did say that there are three structures that help us to become open to the other. One is education, the other is art, and the third is religion. And in that sense, religion is both education and art, in my view, a form of it. So, in one way, I think the argument, or at least the question that you're saying, is that if we don't have religion, therefore we are condemned to be xenophobic, basically. I don't think that's true, because of what Catherine said, which is the presence of the Spirit. All our great religions believe that the Spirit brooded over the waters when the creation either evolved, if we're allowed to mention that word in America, or actually, whatever way it came into being. So that the Spirit is the great kind of fallback situation which we can all quote or refer to when we are going beyond the limits, which I believe are always self-imposed, or all limits. I mean, all the great mystics say that God is limitless, and that's our problem, because we are the ones who always want something there is that doesn't love a wall.
Can I just add a quick question to that? Because while I agree very much with what you're saying now, it seemed to me in your presentation there was a certain claim being made about a revelation from a transcendent deity that was identified with a certain Judeo-Christian revelation specifically, that turned our natures around, and that our natural way of being in our culture, in our anthropology, and I would have thought by extension in our art and our education, prior to this religious revelation from above, from another, is actually condemned to hostility, unless this intrusion from the other occurs. Now, that seemed to fly in the face of your corollary claim in the paper that all religions are basically messages of hospitality. So my question is this: if all religions are capable of hospitality, then what do you do with natural religions? Because for Levinas they weren't. I mean, Buddhism and Hinduism, it's part of paganism. They are not subject to Judeo-Christian revelation. He doesn't mention Islam very much either. And since he's a key figure, and I don't want to personalize this around Levinas, who has said wonderful things about hospitality, but I just wonder about the anti-natural or anti-nature tendency implicit in your paper. Because art and education, prior to religion, you could argue are natural. They haven't received the investiture of the transcendent spirit. And indeed, there are certain forms of natural religion like Buddhism who do not invoke such a transcendent deity and indeed would be called atheistic. So I'm just wondering about, to try and sum up in a sentence, where the limit enters in. I mean, are art and religion always religious implicitly, sort of like anonymously Christian or Judeo-Christian, or is there something radically new, as suggested by this metaphor of crucifixion, whereby something has to happen to us that crucifies our natural tendencies and instincts, as Freud, Hobbes, Marx, and Nietzsche have described them, and as you rehearse them, and turning us round make us hospitable because our nature is naturally hostile.
I wonder if I might put something on that's right on the back of that, just prior to
Please do.
I don't know if it'll make it any easier for you, but I was thinking much the same thing, and the way I was conceptualizing it is that if in fact in the revelatory nature of Christianity there is this idea that mankind is made in God's image, then where from do we get the inherent hostility of humankind? So one, sorry. Two, I also have a concern, and I would phrase it just a little bit differently regarding the insistence on a supernatural revelation to create goodwill between brothers and sisters, and it seems to me a very unembodied perspective, and it seems very deterministic and like essentialistic, that saying that there is a hostility that is at the core of humanism, and that we need something beyond the natural to make us live in harmony with one another. And I wonder if you've, and I heard this kind of in an undertone in both arguments, that in speaking of alterity, you've made the body another. You've said that inherent in the grasping of a child is violence, and that makes the body evil. And that we now insist on this supernatural, unembodied spirit to somehow save us from the flesh. And I wonder if that, it seems to me as if a parallel or kind of a resonance was in that question. I wonder if you could approach that.
Shall I go? Yeah. Yes. Well, I can appreciate both what the two of you are saying, and I would say, first of all, that it's emphatically not what I'm trying to say. That, first of all, Christianity and Judaism are both religions of the body. I mean, the Christian tradition believes in the resurrection of the body, and it would be much easier for it if it didn't. But that's what it does. So that's the first point. The second point is the great phrase from the Apocalypse, Agnus qui occisus est ab origine mundi, the Lamb who was crucified or slaughtered from the beginning of the world. That we are not talking about a moment in history where something happened that saved us. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a plan which the Trinity, when we talk about God or whatever way you want to talk about it, had or has as the sort of benevolent evolution of humanity. That there is a way in which we are called to what Catherine described as the ultimate hospitality, which is to take our place as co-heirs of God. I mean, what Christianity believes is that we are actually called to be well, if you want to put it that way, paid up members of the Blessed Trinity. That's actually what we're being invited to become. Now, in order to do that or to become that, there has to be a certain amount of transfiguration, not destruction, not annihilation, or not even denial of the flesh or the body. But for the body to actually be eternal, infinite, I mean, if you want to run a marathon, I saw an advertisement the other day on the bus as I was coming, where I was promised that even with my physique, I could be trained to run half a marathon if I submitted myself to a certain number of exercises. So that transfiguration of what's sitting here at the moment is to allow me to enter another kind of space-time reality. But what we're talking about here is that we actually believe that what we're called to is life with the divine. So in order to do that, you have to take certain rigorous measures. Now, that's not actually saying that you hate the body or that you regard it as being an inferior or whatever. It's not in any way anti-body, but it's certainly saying you got to get your act together. I heard somebody else saying to me that we're now destined to live until we're 120. That's the age we're aiming for, which makes me middle-aged at this point. But it also means that if I'd known that at the beginning, I might have taken a little more care of myself as I started out. So the Spirit was there from the beginning, and man and woman, He made them in the image of God. That's the other great problem for certainly the Roman Catholic Church and for many other religions, that there is a natural, what I call gynocide in humanity, which means that the destruction of the feminine, which is not necessarily women, it's the feminine in men as well. I mean, there are women and men. I mean, I always highlight the story that Margaret Thatcher and Nancy Reagan both got their hair done by the same stonemason. That there's a way in which there's certain men and certain women, but it's the feminine that's the thing we're all determined to. So that's what I'm calling nature, and that's why I'm saying it has to shape up. I agree with you that the term supernature is probably the one that should be eliminated. It's not supernatural, but there is a difference between God and us. That is the great message of all great religions, that God is other, totally other than us. And yet we are called to that hospitality, and that's the one we have to be most open towards. And I don't know whether that answers, but I'm turning it over to you.
Well, I'm not sure we've addressed the question that Richard asked, namely the question of the moment of revelation of Christianity and what that says about other religious traditions or the presence of the Spirit beyond Christianity and the idea of hospitality. I don't think I would make that kind of radical duality between nature and revelation in terms of hospitality myself, just because I've myself experienced tremendous hospitality, with people who are regarded as sort of belonging to natural religions, who have that seemingly endless and innate tendency to welcome the stranger and to open themselves completely to others. So, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that dichotomy myself. So I don't know if you want to pursue this or.
Well, I think John wants to come in. John, is it related to this? Maybe this may actually be our last question because we're
kind of to Patrick, I've never been so charmed by someone I think I disagree with so completely. I'm thinking as a teacher. That's been my profession, and that's what I'm studying to be better now. And I think as a teacher, I've spent a lot of my time thinking about how to clear out the junk that people have, I think, inherited or introjected so that they can have their natural ability to reflect upon the world, their natural ability to grow, come out. And as a Christian educator, I think that what I think about also is the, like in some of the Eastern Christian traditions, the idea that the resurrection, one of the most important parts of the resurrection was that it overcame our fear of death, so that it allows us to engage the world, to grasp the world without that fear. So do you think that there are dangers to that particular view of education?
Yes, I think that education is a work of art. That I think people are lucky if they're educated. I think there are 6.5 billion people on the planet, and most of them are never educated. And our systems of education, which we have put in place, are determined to wipe imagination off our desktop, that they are the opposite of education. They concentrate on memory, and they insist that, and now we have got in Europe a plan for 2015 where every child of 4 years of age is destined to the murder machine, that they will all be what we call educated. And I think that, and I would quote Harry Potter as the greatest deconstruction and antidote to that Joanna Rowling has connection with 52 million children in a way that our education system does not and should have. So the first point is that I think education is something that happens. What Buber says is that all living is meeting, and the genuine educational relationship happens between two people, not between books or between. So if you actually meet the right person, that is a revelation as far as I'm concerned. It's a miracle. And it happens very rarely to people, but some people then can educate themselves. You know what Picasso said when he was asked about education in art in France, said, give them rotten conditions and let the teaching be bad, bad, bad. So, you know, there are a percentage of people who are geniuses and who don't need any help from anybody. But then I say they are directly in connection with the spirit. So what you're saying is that as an educator, your job is to clear out the junk that children have been almost like fast food or service or whatever it is. Now that is a possibility. It's always the great argument. Is it nature or is it culture? Is it DNA or is it what happened to them when they were 3, 2, 1 as they were in their homes? I'm not particularly sure which it is. I am worried about the 2 7-year-olds who won't stand beside each other because one is this or one is that. That is the great scandal. Whether it happens by somebody indoctrinating them or whether it happens because they are tribal by nature, I don't know the answer to that question. But what I am saying is that religion as revelation happens to people by natural sacraments, that revelation always occurs in this world, and that we have had the temerity to limit sacraments to 7 sacraments, whereas it can be anything, as what Van Gogh calls the natural sacraments of springtime, or people. So an education is the miracle that happens when we all know the experience. You love your geography teacher, so you become great at geography. It's the person that does it, not the atlas. Anyway, that may not answer anything, but...
Okay, there's several people who still want to come in, but I'm going to have to wrap it there because we have another panel, as you know, starting in 25 minutes, and these people have to be photographed in the meantime, or Ben will never forgive me. So I would like to, on your behalf, thank very much our 2 panelists, and I'm sure... Thank you.